Hello and welcome to the first virtual lesson of the year, which is childhood. Just a little bit of explanation first of all for those of you who are new to sociology. There are 3 exams at the end of 2 years and we have 2 hours per exam if you get the standard amount of time. The first unit that we teach in sociology is family and households, and that goes up to Christmas, and that makes up half of your Unit 2 paper. So that's half of your Unit 2 paper. So this is part of that families and households conversation. There are 6 topics for families and households. There's childhood, there's couples, there's demographics, there's patterns, there's theory, or what's the job of family, and then there's government policy. So this is one of those 6 topics. You could get an essay on this topic in your exam. So the page numbers are at the bottom of this slide, so page 178 to 187, so you can go and have a look at that. And this is what I've based this chat, lesson, video, whatever you want to call it, on. And so in an essay in sociology, we want to have the debate. And that's what we want to do in our introductions. Whatever essay we're writing, a 20-mark essay or a 30-mark essay, we need to write an introduction. And in that introduction, we want to have the debate. So here we have in front of you the debate that I'm going to have with you throughout this lesson. Okay, and I'm going to break that down into 3 chunks. Yeah, so when I'm looking at childhood, I'm not just looking at childhood. I'm saying to myself, is childhood socially constructed? What does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. Has the position of childhood improved? We'll talk about that as well. And what is the future of childhood? So in having a conversation about childhood, we need to understand that it's socially constructed. We need to look at how it's improved, if it has improved, and then we need to have a little look at the future of childhood. Again, in an essay, that's exactly what we'd want to do. In our introduction, we'd have that debate of, is it socially constructed? Has it improved? What's going to happen in the future? And then that's going to give us a really good way of dealing with this conversation. So that is your debate. Number 1, childhood as a social construction. Here, we need to understand what socially constructed means. That means society decides what childhood is. Okay? So I don't know about you. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but when does childhood start? It's a really good game to play. When does childhood start? When does childhood end? An even better game to play. Some of you might be sitting there going, oh, I don't know if I feel like a child. I'm 17. I think I'm feeling like an adult. Are you an adult? I don't know. When do you define these things? Our laws are really funny. There are loads of things going on in terms of our laws about driving at sort of 16, 17, having a provisional licence, getting married with your parents' consent at 16, and in the real world, 18. I don't know how many people get married at 18 though in Britain anymore. That's another socially constructed kind of thing. 28 is pretty much the average age of people getting married in Britain if they choose to get married. Yeah. What other laws? There's alcohol, there's smoking. All of these things have age restrictions. And the reason they have an age restriction is because they want to protect childhood in that kind of thing. So therefore, we socially construct it. There's no biological change at 18 in our country, or maybe 21 in other countries, where you change from being a child to an adult. And in some ways, I don't know, is there a biological thing that happens? I suppose for women when they start menstruating, for men when their Adam's apple drops and their voice drops and breaks, yeah, then maybe that is, but then that's kind of 11, 12, 13, maybe even as young as 9 in some cases. And is that when people become an adult? It's kind of a little bit of a messed up thing, and it depends on your culture or any of those things about this kind of topic. So let's move in and have a look at it in a more sociological way. So here's my little spider diagram on social construction. I think I'm going to start with top right, modern Western notion. And what WAG is bringing to us as a sociologist is that the childhood is not fixed. If you go to different cultures and different places, you will find that childhood is viewed in very different ways. In some of the Polynesian islands near Australia, then they don't really have an idea of childhood. In Britain, the age of consent is 16. In France, the age of consent is 14. So that implies that you're an adult, maybe more or maybe more adult at 14. In our history, people have been promised to be married at the age of 2 or 3. Yeah, and sometimes that happens again in other cultures around the world. There's no sort of sexual element to that. It's just a sort of power thing between families, but that can happen. So childhood is not a fixed thing as far as WAG is concerned. And to sociologists like Pitcher, there is what defines childhood is this separateness that there is between the adult world and the childhood world. And a lot of those laws that I've already talked about, and you can think of lots more, is a way of sort of separating adulthood from childhood. But what's really interesting, and the thing that I've underlined here, is that the American version of childhood is being broadcast around the world. How's that happening? Well, it's happening through music, it's happening through film, it's happening through sitcoms, it's happening through things that you binge watch on Netflix. That this idea of what a child is very clear in American culture, and American culture dominates the world in terms of the media that there is that goes around the world. So what we're really saying is that when we're talking about the modern Western notion of childhood, we're really talking about the American idea of childhood. And that American idea of childhood is becoming more and more pervasive. I'm reminded here of the First Nation people in America. Some people might have called them American Indians at some point if you've played Cowboys and Indians or games in that kind of way or watched Western films. But First Nation people is how they like to be referred to themselves. I'm remembered of the quite a lot of tribes. They didn't have an idea of adulthood or childhood. It was just, are you productive or are you not productive? So when you wanted to become an adult, as it were, in some of the tribes, you would go off into the forest and you would, with a knife, and you would kill an animal, and you would bring that animal back so that the tribe could eat, and therefore you're showing you're productive. As far as a woman is concerned, in lots of those tribes, it would be when you gave birth to your first child, and then again you're being productive. Yeah. So there are lots of different types of childhood around the world, but it does seem that this Western idea of childhood is getting more and more pervasive. So I've kind of mentioned these cross-cultural ideas already, but it's good to have a very clear picture in our mind. Different cultures have different ideas about what childhood is. And here I'm kind of reminded of families that I've been aware of in Colombia and places in and around that country in Central and the north of South America, where quite often children need to work to put food on the table, and it wouldn't be a strange thing for a child to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning, go and work for 3 or 4 hours, go to school, go and work for another 3 or 4 hours, and then come home, because that money that child is bringing in is the food for the family for that week. Now, in our country, we don't really have that, and we have laws that prevent those kind of things from happening. But we do need to be aware that childhood is different for different people. And again, I'm reminded of my friend who was a Somalian soldier for one of the rebel groups, and he was co-opted into the Somalian sort of rebel group. Really brutally, he was forced to kill his own parents. Because that's what happens with these child soldiers. Yeah, the Somalian revolutionary force came into his village. They put all of the adults out there in front, and they said, "You've got 2 choices. You can either kill your parents, or we'll kill your parents, and then we'll kill you." And they do that to dehumanise you. He's now a lecturer at a university locally to us, and lectures about African countries and colonialism and those kind of things. But the brutality of him having to do that, his childhood stops there at that point. Yeah. So when he was 7, that was it. No childhood after that point. Whereas some of you would still feel as if you are children. So it's a very valid conversation to have a conversation about this cross-cultural kind of conversation. Now we get to the more sociological bit, which is the history of childhood. We've got to remember that childhood didn't really exist unless you were posh, and probably only 1% of the country in the 19th century was posh and upper class. And so Aries talks about this, how childhood didn't exist, and then as time goes on, childhood becomes more and more prominent in our culture. And now we have this cult of childhood, this modern cult of childhood, where pretty much everything in our society is centred around children, having children, what those children need, protecting those children. So we've gone on a journey from children being not very valuable and in some cases being treated as little adults, right the way through to children being some of the most important people in our culture. Aries, very good to have a look at. Okay, and finally, for the social construction thing, we need to have a little conversation about, well, why has that changed? That Aries conversation about not childhood to loads of childhood, well, why has that changed? The most important thing, I think, would be schooling. Compulsory schooling started at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, 1896, 97, when it became compulsory for a lot of people up to the age of 11. And then, 1940s, it became sort of 14, 1944 Butler Education Act, and then it sort of raised to where we are now to 18. And so while you're at school, you're not being productive for society. You're not earning money, you're not paying taxes. So therefore, that's that separateness kind of idea that we've talked about before. So you are a child while you're in education. But we also need to be aware that there are smaller families nowadays because of healthcare and medicine that we've got has improved, and we have specific medicine now for children called paediatrics. And laws. We've already talked about lots of laws in this little conversation that we've been having. But these laws are prime in helping us. But by far, and pretty much I would argue by far the most important thing that you will learn in families is that women's position has changed in society. And as women's position has changed, because women tend to be the main carers of children and have been historically, then that means children's positions have changed in society as well, which is why there's a nice blue circle around it to help you understand that the change in the position of women is vital to how and why childhood exists in the way that it exists today. So the second part of our conversation, our debate on childhood, is, has the position of childhood improved? Number 2. So we come to the third part of our debate. Yeah, again, remember a debate both sides. So I've hopefully been trying to lay out in this lesson both sides of each of the numbers. So here with the future of childhood, we're going to have a look at two ideas. Okay, so when we're thinking about the future of childhood, one of the ideas we have is that childhood is disappearing. And one of the reasons for that is a postmodern sociologist called Postman is because of technology, yeah, and I suppose the decline in the print media. Okay, so if we go back in history a little bit and we go back to the sort of 18th, 19th centuries, if you wanted to get hold of a naughty or erotic kind of bit of fiction, you had to A, be able to read, not a given in the 18th or 19th century, but then you had to be educated as well, and educated enough to understand. Let me give you an example of that. Chaucer, a very famous English poet and author, wrote a poem, a tale, called the Canterbury Tales, and one of those Canterbury Tales was The Merry Wife of Bath. Now, I challenge you, read it. Go and read it now and see if you can find out where the naughty bits are. Because in that, there are lots and lots of naughty bits. But unless you understand what's going on and you have a certain level of intellect, yeah, then you're not going to understand how naughty they are. Yeah, something like Lady Chatterley's Lover, the D.H. Lawrence book, was banned for being too racy. But again, there was only bits of it that were racy, and again, they were described in such a way that you would need to have a certain level of intellect to be able to access it. Okay, so in today's world, that's not the case, is it? Yeah. You just have to know what words to put into a search engine and how to turn off the security on that search engine, and you get access to whatever image you want. And as soon as you've seen one of those images, you can't take that away. It's not about intelligence at that point, it's about what you've seen. And then seeing those images steals your bit of childhood. So therefore, Postman is arguing that because of our access to technology, then we are losing the innocence that we might have had, and that you would need educated out of you at an older age. Whereas Opie is going to argue against that point of view. Opie is saying that childhood is not disappearing. In no way is it disappearing, because there is a separateness to childhood still. There's Baby Gap, there's Baby H&M, there's Baby Doctors, and there still is this separateness to childhood. And a whole sort of capitalist kind of marketisation of childhood that encourages parents to spend loads of money on their children. And if they don't spend loads of money on their children, then they're disadvantaging those children for their future lives. Whereas postmodernism, carrying on this conversation of the future of childhood, postmodernists are kind of having a conversation about what's been happening over the last 30 years or so since the internet has sort of come about. And postmodernists are going to argue that there's more choice and diversity in today's world. They're going to argue that there's no truth. But they're also going to argue that there's a blurring of the lines. And I appreciate this is a little bit disgusting to have this conversation with you, but I think you can handle it now. You're big grown-up kind of people. My kids are a little bit grown up now, but when my eldest daughter was about 4 or 5, we went in Baby H&M, and we were having a little conversation, and we were wandering around, and she needed some underwear, so we went to have a look at some underwear, and one of the pairs of pants for a 4-year-old girl had "Sexy Beast" written on the front of the pants. Well, I think that's inappropriate. I think that's completely inappropriate, because a 4-year-old is not sexy and is not a beast. They are a child. Yeah. So that blurring of the lines of when do you wear adult clothes, when do you wear children's clothes, and I think in our culture that's being blurred more and more and more. That children younger and younger are dressing more and more like adults, and therefore it's harder to determine whether they are children or whether they are adults. So therefore that blurring of the lines is a very postmodern kind of conversation. And Jenks, the postmodern author, really ploughs into that conversation, having this idea about uncertainty. How in our society, the way our society is worked and the way our society is breeds uncertainty. Okay, so you might be in this position yourself, or your parents have got divorced. But your parents have a stronger link to you as the child than they might have to each other in this postmodern world that we live in. So therefore we have this situation where we define our identities through our children rather than through our partners who we choose. Yeah, because our children are locked into us in that kind of way. So in a last ditch, I suppose, to get our identity sorted out and our who we are and what we are sorted out, we might begin to start defining ourselves through our children, because that gives us the solidity with which to define ourselves. Whereas defining yourself as Alistair's wife or Viv's husband might not be as solid, because we might not be with them in 10 years or so, whereas our children will always be our children. So that uncertainty in our world is something that Jenks talks about. Okay, so in conclusion, and in the conclusion of an essay, we'd want to answer the question. So I'm just going to go over everything that we've talked about just gently, and the key words are there for you to see. They're the kind of key terms I'd expect you to write in your essay. So I'm just going to read the topic summaries, and in your textbook, the topic summaries are brilliant and really help you understand what a conclusion should be like. Okay, so childhood is a social construction and varies between times, places and groups. Most sociologists see our idea of childhood as a fairly recent one, the result of industrialisation and other social changes. Modern society constructs childhood as a time of vulnerability, innocence, and segregation or separateness from the adult world. Some argue that we are witnessing a disappearance of childhood, and the media erode the boundary between childhood and adulthood. In postmodernity, adult surveillance and control is increased. March to Progress sociologists, like Wilmot and Young, believe we live in an increasingly child-centred society. They state that children have never had it so good. Critics to this view argue that this ignores the continued existence of child poverty, abuse and exploitation. Child liberationists, that's child freedomists, they want to free children from their oppression, argue that children in a modern Western society are victims of age patriarchy and are subject to the adult control. And the new sociology of childhood argues that we must take the perspective of the child, and that's pretty much where I think our society is at the moment. So hopefully this makes sense to you. Hopefully this helps you with the textbook and your learning in lessons, and hopefully you can use this maybe as a revision tool to help you with when you're revising for sociology exams in a couple of years' time. Thank you very much.